The chessboard is being reset right before our eyes, and the pieces moving across the Persian Gulf tell us everything we need to know about where this is heading. While mainstream media runs stories about diplomatic progress and cautious optimism, the USS Abraham Lincoln carrier strike group is already in position near Iranian waters, and Pentagon sources just confirmed that a second aircraft carrier, likely the USS George H.W. Bush from the East Coast, could deploy within 2 weeks. This isn't routine naval maneuvering. This is the largest concentration of American firepower in the region since Operation Midnight Hammer last June, when the United States struck 3 Iranian nuclear facilities in what Trump called a message Iran couldn't ignore. That operation involved 125 aircraft, F-35 stealth fighters, strategic bombers, and over 4,000 military personnel, all coordinated in absolute secrecy until the bombs fell. Now we're watching the sequel unfold in real time. Trump just met with Netanyahu for 3 hours at the White House, and his public message was clear. Negotiations are the preference, but if Iran doesn't come to terms, the outcome won't be pleasant. He's dangling the carrot of economic reintegration while simultaneously moving an armada into striking distance. The Iranians, meanwhile, are caught in an impossible bind. Their currency collapsed after nearly 7,000 protesters were killed in January's brutal crackdown, deaths verified on the ground, not regime propaganda numbers. Their nuclear program was set back significantly by last summer's strikes, and the snapback sanctions triggered by European powers are strangling what's left of their economy. Yet Tehran insists any negotiations must focus solely on the nuclear issue, refusing to discuss their ballistic missile arsenal or support for regional proxies like Hezbollah and the Houthis. That's a non-starter for Washington and Jerusalem. This isn't just about uranium enrichment percentages or centrifuge counts. This is about whether America can reassert dominance over a critical choke point for global energy supplies, whether Israel can permanently neutralize an existential threat, and whether the architecture of power in the Middle East gets rewritten for a generation. The real question isn't whether diplomacy will work. It's whether diplomacy was ever the actual objective or simply theater designed to justify what comes next. So let's talk about what's actually happening in the waters surrounding Iran right now, because the pieces on this chessboard are moving faster than most people realize. The USS Abraham Lincoln carrier strike group didn't just casually drift into the Persian Gulf on some routine patrol. This is a Nimitz-class nuclear-powered supercarrier that was yanked out of the South China Sea in mid-January and sent racing across the Indian Ocean with a very specific mission profile. And now, as of yesterday, Pentagon sources are confirming that the USS George H.W. Bush is being readied for deployment from the East Coast, potentially arriving in theater within 2 weeks. That would give the United States 2 full carrier strike groups operating simultaneously in the region for the first time since last March, when both the Harry S. Truman and Carl Vinson were stationed there during operations against Houthi forces. Now, let me explain why this matters in ways that go far beyond the usual show of force narrative you're hearing in mainstream coverage. A single carrier strike group represents somewhere between 60 and 90 aircraft, multiple guided missile destroyers with Aegis combat systems, cruisers loaded with Tomahawk cruise missiles, and likely at least one fast attack submarine lurking somewhere beneath the surface that nobody's talking about. The Abraham Lincoln alone carries F-35C Lightning II stealth fighters from Marine Fighter Attack Squadron 314, multiple squadrons of FA-18 Super Hornets, EA-18G Growler electronic warfare aircraft, E-2D Hawkeye early warning planes, and a full complement of helicopters. The escorts traveling with it include the USS Spruance, USS Michael Murphy, and USS Frank E. Peterson Jr., all Arleigh Burke-class destroyers with vertical launch systems capable of unleashing barrages of precision-guided munitions. But that's just what we can see on the surface. What we don't see publicly confirmed are the Ohio-class guided missile submarines, the SSGNs, each of which can carry up to 154 Tomahawk cruise missiles. We know the USS Georgia participated in Operation Midnight Hammer last June when it launched more than 30 Tomahawks at the Isfahan nuclear facility. The Navy operates 4 of these SSGNs, and interestingly, in September of last year, the Navy pulled both the USS Ohio and USS Florida off the deactivation list, preserving this massive strike capacity right when tensions with Iran were beginning to escalate. That's not coincidental planning. That's strategic foresight for an operation that was already being mapped out months in advance. And let's be very clear about what Operation Midnight Hammer accomplished, because this is the context that frames everything happening right now. From June 13th to June 24th of last year, the United States and Israel conducted coordinated strikes on 3 Iranian nuclear facilities at Fordow, Natanz, and Isfahan. This wasn't some limited precision strike. This was a massive operation involving 125 aircraft, F-35 stealth fighters, B-2 strategic bombers, and over 4,000 military personnel. The operation was conducted in absolute operational security until the bombs started falling, and it set Iran's nuclear program back by an estimated 18 to 24 months, according to intelligence assessments that leaked afterward. Trump referenced this directly when he met with Netanyahu on Tuesday for nearly 3 hours at the White House. In his statement afterward on social media, he said, and I'm quoting here, "Last time Iran decided that they were better off not making a deal and they were hit with midnight hammer. That did not work well for them. That's not subtle diplomatic language. That's a direct threat wrapped in a historical reminder of what happens when Iran miscalculates American resolve. And the phrasing is important because it reveals the strategic logic at work here. Diplomacy is being pursued, yes, but it's diplomacy backed by overwhelming military capability, positioned exactly where it needs to be to execute kinetic operations on extremely short notice." Now, Netanyahu came to Washington specifically to lobby Trump on what any Iran deal must include. Israel's position is straightforward and non-negotiable from their perspective. They want the talks to cover not just uranium enrichment and nuclear infrastructure, but also Iran's ballistic missile arsenal and Tehran's support for regional proxy forces like Hezbollah, the Houthis, and various militia groups in Iraq and Syria. The Israelis are looking at Iran's missile program and seeing an existential threat that doesn't require a nuclear warhead to be strategically dangerous. Iran possesses one of the largest ballistic missile arsenals in the Middle East, with systems capable of striking anywhere in Israel, most of the Gulf states, and parts of southern Europe. Netanyahu's argument to Trump was that you can't separate the nuclear issue from the missile issue because the delivery systems are what make nuclear capability operationally meaningful. But here's where the negotiating dynamic gets interesting. Iran has already publicly stated through multiple official channels that the ballistic missile program is completely off the table. Ali Shamkhani, an advisor to Supreme Leader Khamenei, said explicitly yesterday that Iran's missile capability is not negotiable under any circumstances. Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian has indicated willingness to discuss the nuclear program, but only if those discussions are conducted without threats and focus solely on uranium enrichment, centrifuge operations, and sanctions relief. The Iranians are essentially saying, we'll talk about the nuclear issue, but we're keeping our conventional deterrent capability intact and we're not abandoning our regional allies. This creates what game theorists would call a Nash equilibrium problem. Neither side can achieve their preferred outcome without the other making concessions they've publicly declared unacceptable. Trump wants a comprehensive deal that addresses nuclear weapons, missiles, and proxy support. Netanyahu wants all three plus verification mechanisms that would essentially give the United States and Israel permanent surveillance access to Iranian military facilities. Iran will only discuss the nuclear program in exchange for sanctions relief and economic normalization, and they view their missile arsenal and regional influence as sovereign rights that aren't subject to foreign veto. So what happens when diplomacy encounters an immovable obstacle? You position overwhelming military force as close to the target as physically possible and you compress the decision timeline. That's exactly what's happening right now. The deployment of a second carrier strike group doesn't just double the available firepower, it fundamentally changes the operational calculus. With 2 carriers on station, the United States can sustain continuous combat air patrols, maintain 24-hour strike readiness, and execute simultaneous multi-axis attacks while keeping sufficient reserves for defensive counter-air operations. The carriers can also rotate operational tempo, meaning one can conduct high-intensity flight operations, while the other recovers and rearms, giving planners the ability to maintain pressure over an extended campaign if that becomes necessary. But carriers are just one component of what military analysts are calling the largest American force concentration in the Middle East since Operation Midnight Hammer. Approximately 35 F-15E Strike Eagles from the 494th Expeditionary Fighter Squadron have deployed to Muwafaq Salti Air Base in Jordan. These aren't air superiority fighters. These are deep strike platforms optimized for penetrating heavily defended airspace and delivering precision-guided munitions against hardened targets. Jordan provides an ideal launch point for operations into western Iran, cutting transit time and reducing the aerial refueling requirements that would be necessary for sorties originating from carriers in the Gulf. Speaking of refueling, there's been a massive surge of tanker aircraft into Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar. Tanker deployments are actually one of the most reliable intelligence indicators of imminent air operations because modern strike packages are completely dependent on aerial refueling for deep penetration missions. You don't deploy KC-135 Stratotankers and KC-46 Pegasus tankers in large numbers unless you're planning flight profiles that require multiple refueling brackets. And according to open-source flight tracking data analyzed by independent researchers, there have been more than 80 military cargo flights into the region over the past 3 weeks, delivering additional air defense systems, munitions, spare parts, and support equipment. The air defense component is particularly telling. Multiple reports indicate that additional Patriot and THAAD batteries have been deployed to Gulf states, ostensibly to defend against potential Iranian retaliation. But think about what that signals strategically. The United States is pre-positioning defensive systems to protect both its own forces and allied nations from the inevitable counterattack. That's not the posture you adopt if you're planning to achieve your objectives through negotiation. That's the posture you adopt when you're preparing for a shooting war and you want to minimize the damage Iran can inflict in response. There have also been reports, unconfirmed but consistent across multiple intelligence sources, that B-2 stealth bombers have been moved to Diego Garcia, the joint US-UK base in the Indian Ocean. Diego Garcia has runways long enough to support the heaviest strategic bombers, and it provides an ideal staging point for strikes against hardened and deeply buried targets like underground nuclear facilities and command bunkers. The B-2 is specifically designed for penetrating sophisticated integrated air defense systems and delivering massive ordnance penetrator weapons, the so-called bunker busters, that can destroy targets buried under hundreds of feet of reinforced concrete and rock. If you're planning to take out Iran's remaining nuclear infrastructure, particularly the Fordo facility, which is built into a mountain, you need B-2s delivering 30,000-pound GBU-57 bombs. Nothing else in the American arsenal has that capability. Now let's look at what's happening on the Iranian side, because this isn't a one-sided escalation. On February 3rd, IRGC Navy gunboats tried to stop and seize the tanker Stena Imperative in the Strait of Hormuz. The tanker ignored them and continued under escort by the USS McFall. That same day, an Iranian Shahed-139 drone approached the USS Abraham Lincoln and was shot down by an F-35 about 500 miles from Iran's southern coast. 2 days later, the IRGC Navy claimed it seized 2 foreign oil tankers near Farsi Island for alleged fuel smuggling. These aren't random incidents. This is Iran probing US resolve, testing response times, and signaling it can still threaten shipping through the world's most critical oil choke point, even with a carrier strike group offshore. The strait is just 21 miles wide at its narrowest point, and roughly 20% of global oil moves through it every day. Iran knows this is its main leverage. If talks collapse and the US strikes, Tehran's most effective response isn't hitting US forces head-on, it's choking the strait, spiking oil prices, and turning a regional war into a global economic shock. Iran has been public about its preparations. In Tehran, the Friday prayer imam warned any US attack would trigger a response capable of destabilizing the region. Foreign Ministry spokesperson Esmail Baghai said Iran is more than capable of a regretful response. Military officials claim their missile capabilities improved since last June's conflict with Israel, when Iran launched multiple waves of missiles and drones. Analysts assessed more than 300 ballistic missiles were fired, showing both scale and willingness to expend them. Tehran also rolled out propaganda in Revolution Square, showing US jets swarming a burning aircraft carrier. It's aimed at domestic audiences, but it signals doctrine. Iran can't win conventionally, so it leans on asymmetric responses, mining Hormuz, striking US bases in Qatar, Bahrain, and Kuwait, activating proxies across Iraq and Syria, and potentially hitting US interests abroad through Hezbollah networks. Gulf states have been quietly pressing Trump not to strike. Regional officials say the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and Kuwait all host US forces and would become targets in any major conflict. They need US security guarantees, but they also need workable relations with Iran to avoid becoming collateral damage. The Saudis' worry strikes could reignite proxy wars in Yemen and Lebanon, undoing years of de-escalation, which raises the question Washington won't answer publicly. What's the objective? Forcing a comprehensive deal through maximum pressure, degrading Iran's military so it can't threaten Israel or Gulf shipping, or regime change, using protests as cover for collapsing the Islamic Republic? And inside Iran, the last 6 weeks matter. Protests that began over the collapsing rial and power blackouts have turned openly political. Crowds chant, "Death to the dictator," wave the lion and sun flag, and call for the overthrow of the Islamic Republic. The regime's response has been brutal. Death toll estimates range from Iran's official figure of just over 3,000 to independent counts of 6,000 to more than 36,000. Human rights activists' news agency has verified at least 6,164 deaths, with 11,630 more under review, while Iran International claims documents show over 36,000 killed in just 2 days in early January. Doctors report protesters shot in hospitals, detainees tortured and assaulted, and mass graves used to hide the true toll. Khamenei admitted thousands were killed, but blamed protesters as foreign-backed terrorists. That claim collapses under scrutiny. These were largely peaceful demonstrations over corruption, economic collapse, and repression, met with live ammunition instead of reform. Trump has been publicly vocal in his support for the protesters, telling them to keep protesting and that help is on the way. That language is deliberately ambiguous. It could mean diplomatic pressure and sanctions. It could mean humanitarian support and communications infrastructure to circumvent Iran's internet blackout, or it could mean military strikes targeting the IRGC leadership and security apparatus responsible for the massacres. Israeli and American intelligence sources have reportedly been tracking senior Iranian officials moving tens of millions of dollars out of the country, which suggests the regime's inner circle believes the end may be near and they're preparing exit strategies. Reza Pahlavi, the son of Iran's last Shah, has been openly calling for targeted military strikes against regime leadership. He's positioning himself as a potential transitional figure for a post-Islamic Republic Iran, though it's unclear how much genuine support he has inside the country versus among expatriate communities. The specter of foreign intervention to facilitate regime change is incredibly controversial, even among Iranians who despise the current government. Nobody wants to see their country turned into another Libya or Iraq, where foreign military action created power vacuums that led to years of chaos and civil conflict. This is the strategic trap American policymakers keep falling into. The moral case for intervention is compelling. The Islamic Republic is a brutal theocracy that murders its own citizens, funds terrorists, and destabilizes the region. The practical case is harder. What comes after collapse? Who governs in the interim? How do you prevent fragmentation along ethnic and sectarian lines? How do you ensure the replacement isn't worse? The fantasy is that remove the bad regime and democracy will flourish. That didn't happen in Iraq, Libya, or Afghanistan. What followed were occupations, insurgencies, sectarian violence, and failed states breeding new extremists. Iran is 3 times Iraq's size, with 85 million people and a far deeper industrial and tech base. The idea you can strike, decapitate the leadership, and watch a peaceful transition unfold is delusion. But here's the counter-argument that Israeli strategists have been making to Trump. If you don't act now while the regime is weak and the protest movement is active, you're going to face a nuclear-armed Iran within 2 to 3 years, and at that point, your options become infinitely worse. The window for preventing an Iranian nuclear weapon through military means is closing rapidly. Even with the setbacks from Midnight Hammer, Iran still possesses the technical knowledge and the industrial capacity to reconstitute its program. They've been playing this game for 2 decades, hiding facilities, dispersing research, and building redundancy into their nuclear infrastructure specifically to survive foreign attacks. From this perspective, the current crisis represents a unique convergence of circumstances: internal unrest creating regime vulnerability, international support for maximum pressure, military forces prepositioned for action, and a president who's already demonstrated willingness to authorize strikes. If you're going to act, this is the moment. Wait another year and the protest movement dissipates, the regime consolidates control, and Iran gets closer to breakout capability. Wait another 3 years and they have nuclear weapons, and suddenly every calculation changes because the consequences of escalation become existentially dangerous for everyone involved. We're watching a high-stakes geopolitical poker game play out in real time. Trump is sitting there with carrier strike groups, strategic bombers, and overwhelming conventional superiority, offering negotiations but insisting they cover nuclear weapons, missiles, and proxy support. Iran is sitting there with a collapsing economy, a legitimacy crisis, and thousands of dead protesters, still insisting its missile program and regional influence are non-negotiable. Netanyahu sits between them, pushing for the most comprehensive deal possible while preparing Israel for potential retaliation. All of this is unfolding against the most comprehensive internet blackout in Iranian history, now stretching past 3 weeks. The blackout prevents protesters from coordinating, limits information about casualties and arrests, and prepares the population for war by cutting Iran off from global networks that could be exploited for intelligence or psychological operations. A second carrier strike group raises the probability of kinetic action without making it inevitable. It compresses the negotiating timeline and raises the stakes. If Iran accepts comprehensive talks covering US and Israeli red lines, this could end diplomatically with sanctions relief for verifiable limits on nuclear work and at least symbolic constraints on missiles and proxies. If Iran insists only the nuclear file is on the table and protests reignite with mass casualties, pressure on Trump to act becomes overwhelming. No one knows what acting means here. A limited strike on IRGC leadership and nuclear sites? A sustained air campaign to cripple Iran's military? Support for opposition forces? And no one knows how Iran responds, mining the Strait, striking Gulf bases, activating Hezbollah against Israel, or racing toward emergency nuclear breakout. These unknowns keep planners awake because war is unpredictable once it starts. You can model scenarios, but fog, miscalculation, unintended escalation, and chaos overwhelm plans. The Second Gulf War was sold as quick and decisive. It became an 8-year occupation costing trillions and hundreds of thousands of lives. So we watch carriers steam toward the Gulf as diplomats trade proposals and Khamenei orders preparations. Trump bets maximum pressure forces capitulation. Iran bets America lacks the will for another Middle East war. Netanyahu bets Trump prioritizes Israel's security. The Iranian people are caught in the middle, dying in the streets as the world debates intervention. What happens next hinges on decisions in Washington, Tehran, and Tel Aviv in the coming days and weeks. The pieces are set, the capabilities deployed, the red lines drawn. Now we wait to see who blinks, or whether we're watching the opening moves of a conflict that reshapes the Middle East for a generation.